Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second lesson of the week. We are still looking at this idea of liberty and how it shapes the fate of Britain in the Americas in this period. So let's start off by looking at this source. This is a famous source that was used in the 18th century to publicize a specific cause. Do you know what that cause is? Let's think about the caption on this medallion. It says, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And if we think about that and we think about the picture that we have in the middle of the medallion of this enslaved African, was basically a medallion that was made by a pottery manufacturer called Josiah Wedgwood, and he created this artifact in order to publicize the abolition cause. So what we're going to be thinking about is this concept of liberty in relation to the Black subjects of the British Empire. So our title, our key question for today is, how far had the British Empire accepted its African subjects as men and brothers? Now, the key meaning behind this slogan was to try and get people to understand that slavery should be abolished because slavery was inhumane, because slavery reduced Africans to chattel, to property. And what the message of this medallion is um, trying to show is that actually Africans are men and brothers, or women and daughters, as some of the medallions also read as well. So it was trying to use this idea of liberty to force people to put pressure on the British government and the British authorities to end the inhumane practice of slavery. So we're going to do another knowledge throwback. We did one yesterday, and we want to think about how slave societies in the Caribbean, in the British colonies, were organized by race. So we know that in terms of the transatlantic slave trade, we looked at this in the Key Stage 3 slavery inquiry, that slavery created this concept of racial difference, or it proliferated this idea, this notion that the races came with innate status. So to be white meant to be superior, and to be white meant to be inferior. And we know that there were levels to status in terms of the Black population. But significantly, the hierarchy meant that if you were of African descent, it meant that you had a lower status, that you were enslaved. And even if you were free, your status was still that you were lower than white. So we know that slavery creates this racial hierarchy, and it's created to justify the use of enslaved labor in this inhumane way in order to make great profits in the Caribbean and in the British colonies. So if slavery were to be abolished, as the campaigners who, like Josiah Wedgwood Smith, who manufactured that medallion, like they wanted, and like the enslaved Africans, who we could say are the original abolitionists because they were trying to abolish slavery from the very first day that slavery started, what would this society look like? What would these societies in the Caribbean look like? So what we're going to see is, does this happen by 1865? Was it possible that enslaved Africans could be freed and would become men and brothers, or women and daughters? Would they be humanized? Would their quest for human dignity and respect and freedom and liberty, would that be granted? So we are going to think about a range of case studies to help us understand that. The first thing that we are going to look at is the story of the Robin John brothers. So you're going to read this story. It's an extract on the screen, but I'll also attach it to the classwork assignment. You need to read the story, and this story is a fascinating account of how slavery even for people who were enslaved and became free, was such an allure, was such an elixir, was such a powerful way for people to make profit. So I'm not going to tell you who the Robin John brothers were and what happened to them. You're going to read this story. And then I want you to make notes after reading the story under each of these headings: liberty, faith, and business. What does the story of the Robin John brothers tell us about each of these three concepts? Okay, so write this up in your books and show how these three concepts played out in their story. So you can either pause it now or just carry on listening to the end of the video and then go back and do the tasks as they come up. So we know then from the Robin John brothers story that liberty was often sacrificed in order for business. Business trumped liberty, as we saw in that previous story. But we know that even in the 18th and 19th century, there were significant individuals who did believe that slavery was a great evil and who did want to abolish slavery. So you've got three key figures here. You've got William Wilberforce, who was an MP in Parliament, Thomas Clarkson, who decided that people needed to understand the evils of slavery in order for them to support the abolition of it. So he went around the country showing and promoting all of the instruments of torture and terror and violence that were used against enslaved Africans to try and get the public really to understand the evil of slavery. And then Olaudah Equiano, who was enslaved himself, and he managed to buy his freedom. And what he did once he became free, unlike the Robin John brothers, is that he became an abolitionist, someone who was working to abolish slavery. And one of the key things he does as part of that work is in 1789, he writes a autobiography of his story of being enslaved in Africa, and then being taken into slavery in the British colonies. And this book, this first-hand account, was a really powerful tool for other abolitionists and Equiano himself to show the true horrors of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. So these abolitionists, were effective activists, and they toiled endlessly to try and lobby the British Parliament to abolish slavery. And in 1807, Britain did abolish the transatlantic slave trade. So once the slave trade was abolished, did that mean that Africans became men and brothers or women and daughters? Let's see by looking at a key source. So we've kind of got like a mini inquiry question here. Did Africans become men and brothers after 1807 when slavery was abolished? What does this source maybe reveal to us? What can this piece of source provide us evidence for in terms of our answer? So we've got a poster here that was given out, that was published in 1838. And it says the abolition of slavery, the glorious 1st of August, 1838. Now, if we think about the previous date of 1807, 1838 is another 30, you do the maths, 30 something years after 1807, another 31 years. So why is this poster publicizing and glorifying and celebrating this day in 1838? And it says, when it is confidently expected that the last vestige of slavery will be swept away in all our West India islands. And basically, this is an organization of abolitionists who are going to hold a Thanksgiving service in church in the English Wesleyan Chapel on the 1st of August, because they want to celebrate the day that slavery is actually free. Because what had happened after 1807 was that the slave trade was abolished, but the institution of slavery itself was not ended. So it became illegal in 1807 to transport enslaved Africans from the west coast of Africa to the British colonies, but it was not illegal to continue slavery itself as an institution in the colonies. So slavery, the institution of slavery in the British colonies, was not actually abolished until 1833. So even after the trade was abolished, slavery and the people who were enslaved still endured this inhumane system. So this is a really interesting notion about historical memory and national memory. So in 2007, that was well, not in 2007, but a few years ago, the HM Treasury, so the British government, the Treasury Department, who deal with all the finances of the country, they put out this tweet that they called Today's Friday Fact, and it says millions of you helped end the slave trade through your taxes. And then it has a do you know kind of fact that elaborates about how British taxpayers and their money went towards the abolition of slavery. So, in order to abolish slavery, it was going to cost the British government £20 million in compensation. But who do you think the £20 million went to? Who should it have gone to? Who deserved compensation for enduring slavery for hundreds of years? As the tweet shows, oh, it has not come up there on my slide. Okay, so as the tweet shows, actually it was the slave owners who were compensated. But interestingly, the tweet doesn't explicitly say that. It says in 1833, Britain used £20 million, 40% of its national budget. This is a huge amount of money to buy freedom for all slaves in the empire. The amount of borrowed in the Slavery Abolition Act was so large that it wasn't paid off until 2015. So the taxpayers in 1833, that money, the British government was still paying that off in 2015. That's the biggest bailout, the biggest government bailout to a group since the 2008 banking crisis. And so this money was actually not given to the enslaved Africans to compensate them for the loss of life, liberty, earnings, and the way in which they were exploited and often murdered in this institution. It was actually given to the slave owners to compensate their loss of property. And the irony is that the Treasury thought it'd be a good idea to tweet that. So, not surprisingly, it didn't take long before the Twitter activists to come for them, and they took this down because they realized actually how ridiculous it would be it was to celebrate the fact that the government used taxpayer money to compensate people who used human beings as enslaved laborers to create great profit for themselves personally. So it wasn't until 1833 that slavery itself was abolished. But did that mean then that Africans became men and brothers after 1833? The trade's abolished, slavery itself is abolished. Does that mean that they become men and brothers? To find out the answer to that, you're going to read an extract from this really brilliant book that I would definitely recommend. It's called Black and British, and it's a short history of Black people in Britain from Roman Britain all the way up to present day. So you're going to read that extract, which is on the classwork assignment tab, and then you're going to write up this gap fill in your book using these missing words. Please highlight the words that you have put into the gap fill. So pause the video here and work on that. Okay, so 3 key dates that we need to consider. 1807, which in 2007, a commemorative coin was made to celebrate the significance of 1807 because it was the bicentenary, 200 years since the abolition of the slave trade. It was a significant turning point, but we know that didn't make enslaved Africans free. The slavery continued up until 1833. And even in 1833, when the institution of slavery ended and the slave owners were compensated, enslaved Africans were forced to work for their former slavers for another 6 years, okay, until the apprentice system actually ended. So by 1838, okay, we've abolished the trade, abolished the institution of slavery, abolished apprenticeship. Did that make Africans men and brothers, women and daughters after 1838? Sorry. In order to answer that, we're going to look at a key individual called Paul Bogle. And he was a Jamaican Baptist deacon, so he was a very religious man, and he was an activist, and he believed in liberty. He believed in justice for the enslaved, the descendants of the enslaved people of Jamaica, and he believed that the British authorities were not actually treating the Black Jamaicans as men and brothers. And so he led a protest in an area of Jamaica called Morant Bay, and he marched for justice and fair treatment for all the people of Jamaica. So, how do you think the British authorities would responded to this? If we think about the social hierarchy again, what Paul Bogle was ultimately protesting about was this inequality, that white people still held power, prestige, economic wealth, economic power. And even though these enslaved Africans were no longer enslaved, they were free, this hierarchy still existed of people who had power and people who were powerless. So, to find out what happens in this Morant Bay protest rebellion, you're going to watch this clip that is linked in the classwork chat. And then I want you to answer these questions in your book. So, what sparked the rebellion? How was it stopped? How were the rebels treated? And how was Governor Eyre treated? Okay, so pause the video here and watch the clip. So, that's the end of that lesson. So, in conclusion, from what we have seen so far, how far had the British Empire accepted its African subjects as men and brothers? Please just write a summary answer to this key question. Thank you, Year 10. See you next lesson.